Seches Nazir Daf Zayin begins with a short Mishnah and contains two additional short Mishnayos, all discussing the topic of how long one's Nazirus is if he does not declare it with a very specific language. So up till now we've been discussing if he gives no time period. Now we're going to talk about if he gives an obscure time period or if he gives a very short time period. Now, some rules to keep in mind are as follows. First of all, the standard Nazirus is 30 days. And there are no Nazirus less than 30 days. If somebody makes Nazirus, it has to be a minimum of 30 days. So if he makes a shorter Nazirus, it's going to have to automatically be at least 30 days. A second rule to keep in mind is if somebody says something and we're not sure what he means, we're going to go with the shorter time period. Of course, as long as it's 30 days. And that is because of the rule of that in Nazirus we go lahaka, we go leniently, we assume he meant the shorter time period rather than the longer time period. A third rule which we're going to see come up is that if somebody says he's going to do a Nazirus in accordance with a certain list, then we assume that he means one Nazirus of 30 days for each item on the list. It's a number, and the number is the number of Nazirusin, and each one is the minimum of 30 days. So let's begin the Mishnah. Mishnah discusses three cases where somebody says something not clear, and for all of them our default is going to be 30 days. So if he says, I am going to do a Nazirus for one big period, or he says one small period. Either way, we assume he means 30 days, and that's how long his Nazirus is. Now, if he says from now until the end of the world, it's also 30 days. The rule in all three cases is 30 days. Okay, now the Gemara does not challenge the first case, the big Nazirus, or the second case, the small Nazirus. Both of them are meant to be 30 days because we don't have any specific information on what's big or small, so we go with the standard. However, the Gemara asks if he says from now to the end of the world, from Mikan Vatzayfa Olam, so he's making Nazirus forever. So it should be a Nazirus Olam. We have the rule of Nazir Olam, that he's a Nazir for his entire life, but he can cut his hair when it gets heavy. So why do we assume that that's not what he means? So the Gemara answers, because we're not clear what he means by saying from now until the end of the world. Some Rishonim explain because if he meant to say for all time, he should have just said for all time. What does it mean for now? What does that mean? And we assume that therefore he didn't mean for all time. We assume he just meant that being Makabal Nazirus, and it seems to me to be taken forever. And this Nazirus that I'm going to do is going to be very difficult for me. It's going to be like for all time. So this Nazir said he's Makabal, therefore he did not give a number or a time period, he merely gave a description of how difficult it is. So what is the number then? The number will have to be the standard, which is 30 days. Okay, now the Gemara is a kasha from a Mishnah. We have a Mishnah that says, it's coming up in Daf Ches, someone says, I am a Nazir from now until such and such place, from here until New York. So how do we calculate that Nazir? So we assume he's talking about a period of time, and we count how many days travel it is from here until New York. And if it is at least 30 days or more, then it goes with the number of days. We assume that's how long he meant his Nazirs to be. If it's less than 30 days, Nazirs can't be less than 30 days, so you default to 30 days. So again, we understand what he means when he says from here to New York, that that's the length of his Naziris, that he means that the Naziris should be as long as the time it takes to travel, but there's a 30-day minimum. Now, the Gemara asks, why don't we say that he means the same thing as we're saying here? Why don't we say that he means to say that this Naziris is as long to me as this long travel? In our Mishnah, we said that when he says from now to the end of the world, we assume he's just describing how difficult it is. So let us also assume that he's just describing how hard it is. And therefore, even if it's a 45-day travel, it should only be a 30-day Nazirus because he's not talking about how long it should be. So the Gemara answers, we're talking about here is he's already on the way. If he's already on the way, then he's clearly talking about how far it is to get there. And he's describing how long he wants this Nazirus to be, and the assumption is that it's one Nazirus for all the days that he's traveling. So Gemara asks, why do we assume that? Why don't we assume, with our third rule that we said, that anytime you make a Nazirus and it's compared to a list of items, each item on the list represents one number, and each one is a separate Nazirus. The Gemara says, therefore we should assume, let's say, every mile that he travels, let's say it's 50 miles, so every mile that he travels should be a separate Nazir. So now he has 50 time periods, 50 Nazirusin of 30 days each. So the Gemara answers, we're talking about a place where people don't measure travel by miles. They don't measure by parsa, is what the Gemara is using. So the Gemara says, okay, so maybe we should measure it by rest stops. So the number of rests, the number of nights he has to spend on the road. Why don't we say that that's what it is? Okay, you don't want to go with miles, but we should still assume that he's referring to a number. And we know that anytime there's a number, it's a number of Nazirs. And now the Gemara proves that. If somebody says, I'm a Nazir like the dirt of the ground, or the hairs on my head, or the sand on the beach, in all those cases, we assume that he means to say a number of Nazirs and equal to that amount of things. And of course, that's not countable. So therefore, it's going to be forever for the rest of his life. And this is a Naziris for the rest of his life. So why don't we say the same thing? It's referring to the days of travel. So Gemara answers, no, there's a difference between when a person says an expression like that and it's something that is a set amount, like our case where it's from here to New York, or where it's something uncountable, which is there is no number attached. If it's something uncountable where there is no number attached, we assume he's not telling me a number. He must be telling me one for each of those, and that's forever. Here, from here to New York is a very countable, it's a very countable, measurable entity, and therefore we assume he's saying from here to New York. We're not going to go with default that he's referring to one Naziris for each item on the list. Now, the Gemara proves this from another Brisa. The Brisa quotes, if somebody says, I'm a Nazir for all the days of my life, or I'm a Nazir forever, that's a Naziris Olam, and he's allowed to cut his hair when it becomes overgrown. But if somebody gives a fixed amount and he says, I'm a Nazir for 100 years, or even for 1,000 years, he's not a Nazir Olam, because he didn't mean to say, because this is not uncountable, this is countable. The first expression is uncountable. All the days of my life, or forever, those are uncountable, and therefore he means to say Nazir is forever. But he says 100 years or 1,000 years, that's countable, and therefore even though he's never going to live that long, it's countable, and he's not a Nazir Olam. If that's the case, even though he's going to be a Nazir the rest of his life, because he can't finish the period, still he can't take a haircut every time it gets heavy, because he's not a Nazir Olam, doesn't have the halachos of a Nazir Olam. Okay. Now, the Gemara wants to give a second answer to explain what is the difference between somebody who says, I'm a Nazir as all the hairs on my head, or there we say it's a number of Nazirsin, as to here where we say that it's not a number for the days of travel, it's not a number of Nazirsin. So Gemara says there's a difference. Hairs on your head are separate entities. Each hair is a separate thing. They stand near each other separately. However, travel, the days follow each other in one long unit. They're not differentiated. Somebody asks, why are you telling me that the days are not differentiated? The Torah differentiates them. It says, separates them clearly into separate days. It's not one long unit. So the Gemara answers, no, that's not what the Torah is teaching me there. The Torah is teaching me that in halacha, the night precedes the day, and each day is part of the night that came before it. It's not coming to teach me that it's a bunch of separate parallel entities, and therefore that's not the halacha. And it's different than hairs, which are separate entities that are near each other. Now, the Gemara now goes back to the original question. We had originally asked why when someone says, I want to be a Nazir from now until forever, why do we say that it's only for 30 days? And we'd given a whole cheshbon that he didn't mean for all the time, he just meant for a short time, and he meant that it's hard for me. And it was talking about how hard it is, and then we had to get into this whole discussion. And then the Gemara gives a whole different answer. The Gemara says this phrase is following on the previous two cases in the Mishnah. In the previous two, he said one period big and one period small. Now he's saying also one period. That's the Gemara's Chedesh. He's saying one period from now until the end of the world. If that's the case, then it cannot be referring to a number of periods following one after the other. He said one period, and he obviously meant one general period, and one general period is 30 days. And all he must be saying is that it's hard for him. And therefore this is different than all the other cases where you ask, why doesn't he say it's hard for him? Why don't we interpret it as that he's saying it's hard for him? It's because he didn't say one. We now begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if somebody wants to make a partial Naziris, a Naziris of just a day, or of just an hour, or of just half a Naziris. So the Mishnah has three cases. The first case, if somebody says, I am a Nazir, and one day, Second case, he says, I am a Nazir and 1 hour. In the third case, he says, I am a Nazir and a half. In all these cases, he has to do 2 Naziris. What's the reason? When he says, I am a Nazir, that's 1 30-day period, and then he adds a day, an hour, or a half Naziris. All those can't be less than 30 days, and it's another Naziris period. So therefore, he has to add another full Naziris period of 30 days. So Gemara asks, why do we need 3 cases? Just say once. There's no such thing less than a 30-day Nazir, so everything he added has to be full. So Gemara says there's a chiddush in each of these. The first one where we said, I am a Naziris and a day, that's a basic halacha, that there's no Naziris less than 30 days, so if he adds a day, he's adding 30 days. Now, you may think that only applies if he adds a day. If he adds just an hour, it's impossible to make a Naziris of an hour. Everybody knows that. So he may have meant to say 31 days. Now, if he says a Naziris plus a day, we don't say that he meant that. But even if we understand that if he says a Naziris plus a day, he means another Naziris, and a Naziris can't be less than 30 days. If he says a Naziris plus an hour, there's a stronger side to say he meant to say 31 days. Because you can't have a Naziris. An hour is not a Naziris. Can't mean it. So, Kamashman that it is a Naziris. In the third halacha, where he says a Naziris and a half, there he's bedafka clearly saying not a full Naziris. He's saying a half. That is exclusory of being a full Naziris. He says a day and an hour. Okay, he could have been referring to a full Naziris. He thought he could do a small one. Here he's dafka saying not a full Naziris. You may think, therefore, he doesn't have to do a full Naziris. Kamashman that no, he does. We now get to the third and final Mishnah on the Daf. This Mishnah talks about a very similar case. Here, instead of saying Hareini Nazir V'sha'achas, I am a Nazir, and 1 hour, he says Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yoyim V'sha'achas. I'm a Nazir for 30 days and 1 hour. So the Gemara understands here he meant to say 31 days, and he doesn't have to do 2 separate periods of Naziris. It's 1 period of 31 days. Has to be 31 days because he can't make a Naziris for hours, so an hour automatically rounds up to a day. But we assume that he's telling me the number. We don't assume he's telling me different periods of Naziris. So the reason is because he's discussing numbers. He said 30 days. We said 30 days, and when he adds another day, he's adding another day. He's telling me the numbers. In the previous one, he just said, I'm a Nazir, and then he started talking about an hour, that it must be another period of Naziris. So the Gemara says, so you see from here that if somebody makes a Naziris of